I am not someone who particularly likes the idea that history repeats itself. I think that this idea can lead to a false sense of assuredness of what will come. I much prefer the idea that it rhymes. There is hardly a day goes by that the president doesn't say his favorite word, tariff. Though traditionally a congressional power, the ability to impose a tax on imported goods is a powerful tool that has its place in any normally functioning government. Contrary to what some might say, there absolutely are situations where a tariff is the correct move. They can be used to reduce the importation of certain goods and to boost domestic production. They can be used as part of a trade deal. If you say you want to increase the purchase of certain goods from one country, you can tariff that good in all of the others so the market will be more likely to buy from them. And they can be used to starve a foreign manufacturing sector. The president, however, is using them on everyone, all at once. He uses them to increase revenue, increase domestic manufacturing, to renegotiate established trade deals, in anger, like when Canada played a clip of Ronald Reagan talking about how un-American and harmful tariffs are, and with Brazil, because they had the audacity to actually charge their right-wing despot who attempted to overthrow a democratic election. Despite how I opened this video, I do think that proven theory and application is a good instructor for how you can expect things to unfold. This is not the first time that we have enacted worldwide tariffs to protect American jobs. The last time around, the result was so disastrous and the reaction so violent that the Republicans who enacted them lost the presidency, the House, and the Senate for over 2 decades. It was widely considered the most disastrous economic policy that America has ever enacted. And now they are being brought back by a man who uses the fact that the United States was in a trade deficit to declare a state of emergency, which allows him to usurp congressional power and levy his own tax on American people via worldwide tariffs. I do not possess the vocabulary to adequately express to you how absurd this situation is. Deficits are not inherently a bad thing. They are very normal. And to use them as a justification to declare an emergency that lets the president commandeer another branch of government's power is vile and disturbing. We have a mercantilist in charge of the government, an understanding of economics that died out the year the country was founded. It is astounding that we are in this position again, almost 100 years later, doing the exact same thing. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs were intended to be a protectionist measure, caused by a fear of manufacturing and job loss due to the Great Depression. We can't really know the impact of the act by itself, because this was a period of severe economic turmoil, though we know for sure that it only served to make things worse. The Republicans at the time threw their full weight behind this act, as this excerpt from Herbert Hoover speaking about the act as he was signing it into law shows. The Republican Party believes that the home market built up under the protective policy belongs to the American farmer, and it pledges its support for legislation which will give this market to him to the full extent of his ability to supply it. We all know what happens when you use tariffs to protect farmers. You end up having to bail them out. The farmers of the time lost access to vital markets abroad due to reciprocal tariffs imposed by countries that were being targeted by the United States. They could no longer sell abroad, and demand for their crops domestically was so low that the price of wheat, corn, cotton, and milk fell to a point where it cost more to produce than it was worth. It was all a cycle. No one had money to buy their products. The farmers no longer had access to outside markets. Now they were stuck with large amounts of goods and no one to buy them. What they had on hand went for pennies on the dollar, and what they were growing for next year's harvest was worth so little that it was better to let it rot in a field. This drove many farmers out of business. This all happened again during the president's first term. He imposed steep tariffs on China. They retaliated. Our soybean, corn, wheat, and dairy farmers lost access to the Chinese market. Their goods became too cheap, and they would not be able to keep going without some sort of assistance. So we bailed them out with our tax dollars. It is also happening again right now as I speak, as a result of the current tariff policy. We are $12 billion and expected to pay them between $10 and $14 billion more. How many times do we have to beat our head against a wall before we notice the blood? As for the manufacturing sector, Hoover had this to say: "There are certain industries which cannot now successfully compete with foreign producers because of low foreign wages and low cost of living abroad. And we pledge the next Republican Congress to an examination and, where necessary, a revision of those schedules to the end that the American labor in these industries may again command the home market, may maintain its standard of living, and may count upon steady employment in its accustomed fields." Eerie, isn't it? If it wasn't for the dialect, this sounds like something that could have been said in April. It was assumed that the result of the increase in prices for imported goods would increase the amount of things being manufactured in America. It was seen at the time as something that would protect American manufacturing. The actual result, however, was the collapse of global trade. Foreign markets, a potential source of funds for struggling businesses, dried up due to retaliatory tariffs. So with no foreign market, merchants needed to focus on the domestic market, where no one had any money. So the people that already couldn't afford anything couldn't afford things even more because the cheaper foreign goods were all gone, and now everyone was getting fired because no one was buying any products. The only way for a business to survive a lack of demand is to cut costs, like the workforce. In 1930, 1,028 economists signed a letter to Hoover begging him not to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law, an act that resulted in the destruction of the only hope the United States economy may have had to weather the Great Depression. In 2018, 1,100 economists signed a letter in opposition to the tariffs and protectionist stance the government had taken, the result of which led to an increase in cost of goods, supply chain instability, and bailouts for farmers that cost the taxpayer $28 billion. In 2025, 1,500 economists signed a letter to the president urging him not to enact his tariff policies. We are seeing an increase in prices, a decline in job growth, supply chain destabilization, and again, we are bailing out the farmers. We are literally making things more expensive for ourselves at a point in history where people are already worried about the increased prices. One of the arguments appearing online is that the whole goal of the tariffs is to devalue the dollar, the goal being that a devalued dollar decreases export costs. It also devalues the national debt. The problem with that is that it will most likely also increase inflation, meaning everything is going to cost more, and that will result in the Fed trying to control that inflation by increasing interest rates, which means slower growth and a potentially higher unemployment. On top of that, even though our goods will become cheaper, because this is being achieved through the vehicle of tariffs, we will also have tariffs placed on us, which will make the cheaper goods more expensive in the countries we're trying to get them to, which solves nothing. At the start of the newest round of tariffs, the administration itself said that the goal was to increase revenue and increase American manufacturing. If we are making money off of tariffs, it is because goods are being imported and not manufactured here. If they are being manufactured here, then they aren't being tariffed. The goal can't be for it to both work and not to work. There has never been a consistent message as to the actual reason behind the tariffs. That's because if there was, it would be easy to take down. So if they instead say that they will do everything, then whatever the outcome is, they can claim was the goal all along. In reality, the administration has no idea what will happen. For some reason, they are expecting a different result than the last time they did this. The rise of the Nazis was greatly propelled by the Great Depression and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. They were able to gain popularity due to the dissatisfaction of the general populace. This dissatisfaction was due to the lack of economic prosperity caused by the incredible burden of repayments due to their loss of World War I and the withdrawal of loans that America had been providing. The withdrawal of those loans was a direct result of the Great Depression. With the loans gone, businesses collapsed. More jobs were lost, and on top of that, they were then impacted by the tariffs. With the collapse of global trade, it wasn't just America that withdrew on itself, it was the world. Germany was heavily reliant on foreign loans and exports. Like the United States, the domestic market was very poor, so their only hope of digging themselves out of the hole they were in was by selling abroad. With their last hopes dashed, the population gave into nihilism. They eschewed democracy and clung to the one man telling them that it wasn't their fault, and that they should actually be proud of who they were. They gave in to populism and fascism. They let evil take power because it was the only thing shouting at them that it had the answer to their problems, that it was the system that had gotten them there that was the problem, and that they knew what had to be done, that they were their only hope. And I'm sure the population relished the opportunity to finally feel good about themselves again. The Japanese were also in a similar situation. They had been an extremely protectionist nation until recently, and for 200 years had little to no foreign trade to speak of. If there has ever been a better explanation as to why protectionism and withdrawing into yourself without wanting to be involved in the world is a terrible idea, it is the history of Japan between 1603 and 1854. For over 200 years, the Japanese had practiced national isolationism. They had very limited outside trade, but what little they did was with China, the Dutch East India Company, and Korea. This was caused by a fear of foreign intervention and a desire to maintain Japanese culture. This limited trade policy was wrenched open by the Americans when Commodore Matthew Perry appeared in Edo Bay with 4 state-of-the-art steam-powered warships. This was a technology that the Japanese had never seen before, and it was utterly terrifying to them. They knew that the rest of the world had progressed to a point where, should they wish to take Japan, it would just be a question of time, not a question of whether they could or not. This was untenable for the Japanese. The Americans refused their orders to sail to Nagasaki, and they knew that there was nothing that they could do about it. They had to capitulate to whatever the Americans wanted. They signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. It opened all ports to the Americans, not just Nagasaki, which had previously been the only port that allowed foreign goods. It allowed the United States to build a consulate, establish peace between both nations, and mandated that any privilege granted to other nations in the future would be granted to the United States as well. The Americans got everything that they had asked for. The Japanese had no leverage, and they would do everything in their power to rectify that. By this time, the Chinese had been dealing with Western destabilization for over a decade. The First Opium War had resulted in an opening of ports and the ceding of Hong Kong to the British. They had been the height of civilization for over 3,000 years. This was the beginning of their century of humiliation. They had only just begun to realize that the seat of civilization had moved west. For the Japanese, however, this realization was as instantaneous as a thunderclap, and it kept them awake at night. The Meiji Restoration saw rapid modernization. They sent their doctors, soldiers, scientists, and engineers abroad to learn as much as they could from the foreigners, and bring their advancements, strategies, technologies, and ways of thinking back to Japan. While they relied heavily on the Americans, they felt a kindred spirit with Germany. As they witnessed the unification efforts by Bismarck, they saw great similarities between their own unification efforts. They knew that if they were to fully modernize, they would need resources. As Japan is a relatively poor resource nation, they knew that the only solution was to colonize nearby countries and gain access to their resources. This resulted in a fierce rivalry with Russia to carve up Korea and China around the turn of the century. While they saw Germany as their spiritual brothers, they sided with the Allies in World War I, primarily due to an early alliance with Britain and the fact that that choice would allow them to take control of German-controlled portions of China, which was their biggest priority at the time. They came out of World War I very advantageously. They had new lands with resources they could begin extracting, and they had started to be seen as the legitimate power in the East. They were still heavily reliant on foreign trade, both imports and exports. While they were still in their early period of expansionism, the Great Depression and collapse of global trade, caused by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, inflamed their worst tendencies. With the collapse of their burgeoning economy, they too blamed the system that had gotten them there. They had come to the conclusion that relying on foreign trade had been a mistake, that they must once again turn inward. They became desperate to secure their own source of resources, which would inevitably require larger parts of China and Korea. The military, which was heavily influenced by Germany, due to the cross-pollination of officers, took control of the government and overthrew and assassinated liberal civilian politicians. They invaded Manchuria in 1931. The army blew up its own railway as a pretext to invade. which is very similar to how the Germans would kill prisoners dressed in their own soldiers' uniforms in a staged attack on the border as a pretext to invade Poland 8 years later. In both Germany and Japan, the economic collapse and subsequent destruction of global trade caused by tariffs was central to the destruction of their liberal democratic institutions. It wasn't the direct cause, but it set the stage for the fascist strongmen of the time to galvanize the public against the system that let them take power in the first place, by promising that they had the answers, that it was the system that had caused all the problems, that they needed more power to get things done, that globalism and free trade had failed. There is a long history of large-scale tariffs causing great harm to both the country implementing them and the world. They have a tendency to destabilize and decrease efficiency in markets. From 1789 to 1913, the United States had high across-the-board tariffs like we do right now. At the time, they were the central revenue system for the federal government. In 1913, that had been switched to income tax. This switch allowed tariffs and therefore prices to fall. It also opened up foreign markets to our own farmers and manufacturers. Tariff policies propped up American monopolies like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. Without cheap foreign steel and oil entering our market, these businesses effectively were able to set their own price for their products. Without foreign competition, weak local production can overinflate and take far more market share than they would normally be allowed to in a free market. The inefficient and wasteful can thrive if they are the only ones allowed to operate. Greed and corruption, as opposed to innovation and fair prices, drove supply. Across-the-board tariffs also allow for unprecedented corruption and inequality. In a system full of people constantly trying to secure their own carve-outs of either protection or enforcement, it demands businesses curry favor with those in power. Tariffs were the vehicle that delivered us to the Gilded Age, filled with its corruption and lobbying, leeching off the incredible power levying them provided. The switch to income tax, as the primary source of revenue, sought specifically to tackle the rampant corruption that we are seeing emerge once again. You may think that we were already there, but I assure you that what we had was nothing compared to what's happening in Washington right now. Just look at the president's meme coin, a way to bribe him out in the open for all to see. It was alleged that President Biden took $10 million in bribes, which everyone freaked out about, but has since been proven to be false. The current president has over $500 million in a meme coin that anyone can buy specifically with the intent to get him to do things for them. He has been given a $400 million plane that he will get to keep after he leaves office. If you care about the corruption, we are back in the Gilded Age. It is beyond clear that the president has personally enriched himself by billions of dollars, and he is using his office and the power he was granted by all of us, the American people, to do it. If you care about what the alleged benefit to the rest of us is supposed to be, I ask you, what are the chances that a Republican wins the next election? This far out, it's probably about 50-50 if you're being fair. Do you think it's a good business decision to spend 2 to 3 years building a manufacturing plant in the United States to manufacture products for a year or two, and then have all of the tariffs that caused you to build here overturned by the next Democrat that gets elected? Because you would have then spent millions of dollars to make more expensive products, and then as soon as the tariffs go away, all of the people that didn't manufacture in the United States are going to put you out of business with their cheaper goods. So the intent cannot be to bring manufacturing back to the United States, because as soon as the tariffs get taken away, you would be destroying any business that actually moved here. So perhaps making revenue is the goal. Well, I ask, who is the one that pays for the price of imported tariffed goods? The importer. What do they do when they have to pay more to sell something here? They sell it at a higher price. So who pays the tariffs? You do. Now that those goods have become more expensive, the local produced versions will also increase in their price. Congratulations, now everything is more expensive. We know this is what happens. We've seen it multiple times. We know this in theory, and we know it in practice, because it happened in the 30s and it happened in 2018. What more is there to say? It is insane to know how tariffs work, and to know what happened the last time around, and to think that this time, this guy can get them to work. For some reason, despite the blatant corruption, incompetence, and childish behavior, people just trust this guy. They think he's a good businessman because he was on a TV show about it. They are probably a little spotty on the history and economics, and they just feel like he knows what he's doing. I want people to learn, and I want to change minds. I am desperately shouting into the void to see if anyone out there is listening. There is an entire world out there saying that what I know to be true isn't. There are people saying the same things that I am, but we're fucking losing. I refuse to sit back and let the charlatan brainwash and destroy a country that I care so much about. If you are someone who thinks that tariffs are a good idea, thank you for watching. Thank you for getting this far. I hope this was enough to make you at least consider how destructive they can be. People can change. Enemies can become friends. I tell you these things, I make these videos to reach out a hand, not to mock or belittle. I want a better world, but I fear we are heading down a path of destruction. As for the current administration, I will echo the words of Congressman Jacob Milligan from 1930, about 2 weeks after the Smoot Hawley Tariffs were signed into law. We hear from certain quarters that prosperity is raging rampant in every corner of the land, that we are enjoying this unprecedented prosperity because Mr. Hoover is president. I am willing to give President Hoover full credit for the so-called Hoover prosperity we are not enjoying. I understand that 2 new planets have been discovered, and that someone has suggested one be named Hoover Prosperity because it is invisible, and the other Farm Relief because it is so far away.